My husband never loved you. He loved what you made him feel like he could get away with. There's a difference. Sylvia Beaumont said it into a microphone at the Hargrove Medical Foundation's annual awards dinner in front of 430 people without raising her voice by a single degree. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, quietly, completely, with the specific stillness of a woman who had decided exactly what she was going to do 3 months before she did it. The woman she said it to was standing 12 feet away, holding a glass of white wine and wearing a smile that had already started to come apart at the edges. If you've ever been the last person in the room to know something that everyone around you already understood, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you haven't subscribed to Velvet Shadows yet, do it now, because this is only the beginning. Sylvia Beaumont had known about the affair for 89 days when the invitation arrived. She hadn't found out through a phone left unlocked on the kitchen counter. She hadn't hired anyone. She hadn't gone looking at all, which was perhaps the most clarifying part of the whole thing. The truth had simply walked into her line of sight on a Tuesday afternoon in September, when she was leaving the hospital after a 12-hour shift and saw her husband's car parked in had never been to together. With another car beside it, she recognized from the driveway of a colleague she had trusted for 6 years. She had stood on that sidewalk for exactly 4 seconds. Then she had walked to her own car, driven home, and made dinner. Her name was Sylvia Beaumont, and she was 44 years old, and she was the kind of woman who, when something terrible arrived, got very, very quiet. She had learned this from her mother, Constance, who had been a federal judge for 22 years, and who had a saying. She had offered exactly once when Sylvia was 19. And dealing with a situation that had felt, at the time, like the end of the world. You don't have to react to everything the moment it arrives. The moment is for them. What comes after is yours. Sylvia had never forgotten it. She had built an entire surgical career around it. And now, at 44, standing in her kitchen, chopping vegetables, while her husband, Mitchell, came through the front door with a story about traffic and a late meeting. She applied it with the same precision she applied to everything that required steadiness under pressure. She said, "There's food on the stove." Mitchell Beaumont was 49 years old and had the specific confidence of a man who had been told he was exceptional by enough people over enough years that he had stopped questioning it. He was a hospital administrator, not a physician, which mattered to him in ways he never said aloud and that Sylvia had understood for years. He had married her when she was a second-year resident, and somewhere in the decade and a half since, he had begun to confuse being adjacent to her accomplishments with having built them himself. He sat down at the kitchen island. He asked about her day. He was charming the way men who were hiding things were charming, attentive, in the deliberate way of someone who's managing a performance rather than simply being present. She watched him. She said the right things. She went to bed. That night she lay in the dark and did the thing she was very good at, which was not reacting, but assessing. The woman was Vanessa Cole. Sylvia had known her for 6 years. They had served on the Hospital Foundation's grant committee, together for 3 of those years. Vanessa was 36, a pharmaceutical sales director, single, and had been to their house for dinner on 4 occasions that Sylvia could recall, sitting at their table, drinking their wine, laughing at Mitchell's jokes with the particular warmth of a woman who had decided she was owed something she hadn't taken yet. Sylvia thought about those 4 dinners. She thought about small things she had noticed and filed away. The way Vanessa's laugh adjusted itself when Mitchell spoke. The way Mitchell refilled her glass before it was empty, while Sylvia's sat half full. The way at the last dinner, Vanessa had touched the sleeve of Mitchell's jacket while making a point about something Sylvia no longer remembered, and Mitchell had not moved his arm away. She had noticed. She had not catalogued it as anything significant, because the thing about trust was that it made you filter evidence differently, not because you were naive, but because you had made a choice to extend someone your interpretation, and you hadn't yet been given reason to stop. Now she had reason. She spent the following week paying a different kind of attention, Mitchell's schedule, which had been predictably unpredictable for most of their marriage in the way hospital administrators' schedules were, began to reveal a pattern. Tuesdays and Thursday evenings. Occasionally Saturday mornings, which he accounted for, with references to a weekend fitness class he had started 6 months ago. The fitness class, she confirmed quietly, did not exist in the way he had described it. She said nothing. She waited. Her father, Bernard Hargrove, called her on a Sunday afternoon, the way he called her every Sunday. From his study in the house she had grown up in, the house that had the Hargrove Medical Foundation's original charter framed on the wall behind his desk. He was 71 years old, and he had been the most important person in every room he had ever entered for so long that he had stopped noticing it, which was, Sylvia had always thought, one of the things that made him genuinely powerful rather than merely influential. She did not tell him. Not that Sunday. She needed to understand the full geometry of what she was dealing with before she moved any piece. That was the thing. Her mother had taught her, and her father had demonstrated. Movement without complete information was waste. It wasn't caution born of fear. It was precision born of experience. The invitation arrived 6 weeks after the Tuesday afternoon outside the restaurant. The Hargrove Medical Foundation's annual awards dinner, black tie, 500 guests. The foundation's name was her father's name, which meant it was, in the specific way of things in their world, also hers. Mitchell's name was on the sponsorship board as a hospital administrator. Both their names were on the invitation, and beneath the attendee list that Sylvia had access to through the foundation's planning committee, Vanessa Cole, listed under the pharmaceutical industry partners block. Sylvia looked at for a very long time. Then she called her brother Owen. Owen Hargrove was 41, 3 years younger, and had their father's mind for structure and their mother's instinct for the exact moment when patience became strategy. He was a corporate attorney who specialized in the specific kind of work that happened when large institutions needed to disentangle from arrangements that had become untenable. He answered on the second ring. "I need to talk to you about something," Sylvia said. "Not tonight. Tomorrow." "Okay." A pause. "How not tonight is it? It involves Mitchell and someone I've trusted professionally for 6 years." A longer pause. Then, "I'll move my 9 o'clock." They met the next morning in Owen's office. She told him everything, with the concise, sequential precision of a surgeon presenting a case. Owen listened without interrupting, which was what he did when he was building a complete picture rather than responding to pieces. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. The first was about their prenuptial agreement, which she answered. The second was about the timeline for the foundation dinner, which she also answered. Then he said, "Do you want to handle this before the dinner or during it?" Sylvia looked at her brother across the desk. "I want there to be no ambiguity," she said. "For anyone." Owen understood immediately. He had known her for 41 years. "Then I need 3 weeks," he said. "And I need you to be patient for 3 more weeks." "I know how to be patient. I know you do." He looked at her carefully. "How are you actually doing, V?" She considered the question. "I'm functioning at full capacity," she said. And then, because it was Owen, which is its own kind of answer, he nodded once. Then he picked up his phone. The 3 weeks were not easy in the way that waiting was never easy when you knew what you knew, and were watching a performance you could see through completely. Mitchell continued his Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He continued the invented fitness class on Saturday mornings. He was, if anything, warmer at home during this period. More attentive, more present, the particular overcorrection of a man who was managing guilt and had decided that being a good husband in the visible ways absolved him of being a dishonest one in the invisible ways. Sylvia let him. She was pleasant. She was present. She was, to all visible appearances, a woman living the ordinary rhythms of a demanding medical career and a long marriage. She thought once, sitting across from him at breakfast on a Wednesday morning, when the October light was coming through the kitchen windows and he was reading something on his phone, with his coffee going cold, that she had loved him. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, not the performance of love, not the habit of it, not the structural convenience of a 14-year marriage. She had genuinely loved him in the early years, the real kind that grew from knowing someone's actual texture rather than their projected surface. She had loved the real Mitchell, the version of him that had existed before the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be had grown large enough to require filling with other people's attention. She allowed herself to feel that, briefly and completely. Then she set down her coffee cup and went to get ready for her 7:30 case. The day of the foundation dinner arrived the way significant days arrived, with an ordinary quality that belied everything contained within it. Sylvia had a surgery at 6:15 in the morning, routine, successful, unremarkable. She was home by 2. She had her hair done by the woman who had done her hair for 20 years. A conversation that was easy and warm and entirely ordinary. She sat in front of her vanity mirror at 4 in the afternoon and looked at her own reflection and thought about what her mother had said 30 years ago about the moment and what came after she had chosen her dress 3 weeks before. Ivory. Not white, not the absence of color, but the particular warm tone of something that knew exactly what it was: her mother's pearl earrings, her father's mother's bracelet, which she rarely wore and which meant something specific to her about whose blood she carried, and what that blood had built. Mitchell appeared in the doorway of the bedroom at 5:45, looking handsome in his black tie. In the way he always looked at these events, polished, purposeful, comfortable in a room full of important people. "You look extraordinary," he said. She looked at him in the mirror. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." The car to the Grand Meridian Hotel took 22 minutes. They sat beside each other in the back seat and talked about the award recipient for that evening, a researcher from Johns Hopkins, whose work on pediatric cardiac abnormalities her father had personally championed. Mitchell offered an opinion about the Foundation's recent grant distribution that was, well, informed and slightly wrong in a way that would have been easy to correct, and that Sylvia chose not to correct. She was watching the city pass outside the window and thinking about Owen's call from that morning. 3 words: "Everything is positioned." She had said, "I know what I'm doing." He had said, "I know. I'm just telling you we're ready when you are." The Grand Meridian's ballroom was the kind of room that had hosted 50 years of the city's most significant evenings, state dinners, political announcements, the specific gatherings of medicine and finance and civic life that constituted the real architecture of institutional power in a city like this one. Her father's name was on a wing of the hospital connected to this hotel. Her mother had received a Lifetime Achievement Award in this ballroom 11 years ago, standing at a podium, with the specific calm of a woman who had spent decades being the most prepared person in every room she entered. Sylvia walked through the entrance with Mitchell's hand at the small of her back and felt the particular texture of a room that she had grown up in, that knew her name before she spoke it, that carried the specific weight of belonging. She saw Vanessa Cole from across the room within 4 minutes of arriving. She was wearing green, not a subtle green, a deliberate one, the choice of a woman who had decided she was arriving somewhere significant and wanted to be seen arriving. She was at a table in the pharmaceutical industry section with 3 colleagues, and she was laughing at something, and her body was angled across the room in the way bodies angled when they were keeping track of a specific person without looking directly at them. Sylvia watched her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back to the Foundation trustee she was speaking with and continued the conversation she was having. Mitchell excused himself twice in the first 90 minutes. The first time he returned in 12 minutes. The second time, 20. When he came back the second time, his tie had been very slightly rearranged, and there was the specific quality of a man who had allowed himself something he was now managing the aftermath of. Sylvia picked up her water glass. She had been drinking water all evening. Their table included 2 Foundation board members, a cardiologist from Stanford, who was receiving an acknowledgement that evening, and the president of the city's largest hospital network, a woman named Dr. Patricia Lim, who had been Sylvia's mentor during her fellowship, and who had the sharp, comprehensive awareness of someone who had spent 30 years watching rooms. Patricia had said nothing to Sylvia all evening, but she had looked at her twice with the expression of a woman who was reading a situation and understanding more than she was being told. The dinner service concluded. Sylvia's father took the stage. Bernard Hargrove at the podium was one of the most familiar sights in Sylvia's life, and one that still moved her in the particular sideways way that familiar things did when you allowed yourself to really look at them. He spoke for 9 minutes about the researcher being honored and the work of Intelligent and what it meant to invest in the kind of science that didn't have immediate commercial applications, but that changed the specific texture of whether children survived certain diagnoses. He spoke with the unhurried precision of a man who had given enough speeches to know that authority didn't need volume or length. It needed truth and the specific credibility of someone who had done what they were describing. The room was completely still when he spoke. It was always completely still when he spoke. Mitchell, beside her, was looking at his phone under the table. At 8:47, something shifted in the room's energy in the way that rooms shifted when a specific kind of intention entered them. Sylvia felt it before she saw the cause. A slight recalibration of attention. The invisible reorientation of the collective awareness of 400 people toward something that was about to happen that hadn't been scheduled. Vanessa Cole stood up from her table. She was still holding her wine glass. She was wearing the expression of a woman who had decided that the evening had arrived at a moment she had been building toward. Not tonight specifically, perhaps, but some version of tonight. Some evening in this world that Sylvia occupied and that Vanessa had spent years moving through as a visitor who had decided she wanted to live there. She didn't tap her glass. She didn't ask for the microphone. She simply stood and waited with the particular confidence of someone who had calculated that her presence alone would create the pause she needed, and the room did pause, because rooms notice that kind of confident stillness, the way they noticed any anomaly in the expected pattern of an evening. "I just want to say something," Vanessa said. Her voice was warm and clear and carried easily. She was looking at Mitchell. "To the people in this room who are brave enough to know what they want and reach for it, you inspire me." She raised her glass in Mitchell's direction. Not a subtle glance, a direct, intentional turn of her body, glass elevated, a smile of a woman who had decided she was claiming something publicly because she had already won it privately. Mitchell's hand, which had been resting on the table, went perfectly still. "To new chapters," Vanessa finished, "and the courage to write them." She drank. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happened when a room full of intelligent people simultaneously understood something they hadn't expected to understand and were processing what to do with it. No one raised a glass in response. No one spoke. 430 people in a room that carried her family's name, and the only sound was the soft click of Vanessa setting her glass back on the table. Sylvia set down her own glass. She rose from her chair the way she had risen from chairs all her life, without performance, without urgency, with the specific economy of movement of a woman who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. She smoothed the front of her ivory gown. She looked across the room at Vanessa, who was still standing, whose smile had begun to show its first hairline fractures of uncertainty at the edges. Then she looked at Mitchell. Mitchell, for the first time all evening, looked back at her directly. In his face was something she recognized, the specific expression of a man watching a situation accelerate past the point where he could manage it. She picked up the table microphone that had been used for earlier remarks. She didn't ask permission. The microphone was at her table because it had always been her table, had been her family's table for longer than Vanessa Cole had been attending these dinners. Sylvia spoke into it. "My husband never loved you," she said. "Not loudly, just clearly. He loved what you made him feel like he could get away with. There's a difference." She put the microphone down. She picked up her clutch. And then, from the far end of the ballroom, from the direction of the private entrance that connected to the hotel's executive corridor, she heard what she had been expecting to hear, the specific rhythm of footsteps that moved, with the measured certainty of people who knew exactly where they were going and had arrived at the place because the moment had been carefully designed. The door opened. Bernard Hargrove stepped back onto the floor of the ballroom, no longer behind the podium, but moving through the room with the unhurried directness of a man for whom this space was not a venue but a context. Behind him came her mother, Constance, 70 years old, silver hair, the bearing of a woman who had delivered verdicts for 2 decades and who understood that presence was its own form of authority. And beside Constance, Owen, 41, with his jacket precisely buttoned and his face carrying the expression of a man who had prepared something thoroughly and was now watching it execute. The room understood, not in a complicated way, in the immediate wordless way that rooms understood when the architecture of a situation revealed itself completely. The foundation bearing the Hargrove name. The patriarch moving through the room toward his daughter. The family that had been here first and would be here last, and that had not, contrary to what the evening had begun to suggest, been caught off guard by any of it. Mitchell saw them, and his face did something Sylvia hadn't seen it do in 14 years. It lost its composure completely, briefly, just for 2 seconds. The expression of a man understanding the full weight of what he had done in a room where the doing of it was fully visible. He had thought he was leaving a marriage. He had not understood that he was attempting to humiliate a legacy. Bernard reached his daughter. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the focused, unhurried attention that had made her feel, since childhood, like the most important thing in whatever room they shared. He took her hand briefly. "We're here," he said quietly. "Right on time," she said. He turned to look at Mitchell. He didn't cross the room toward him. He didn't need to. He simply turned and looked with the specific, measured assessment of a man who had already made every decision that needed making and was now simply allowing the consequences of those decisions to become visible. Mitchell stood up from his chair. "Bernard." His voice was careful in the way voices got careful. When their owners were running rapid intercalculations and needed time, they were not going to be given. "Mitchell." Bernard's voice was pleasant, professionally pleasant in the particular way of a man who had long since stopped needing to signal displeasure through tone. "I think we should find some time this week to talk." "Not tonight. Tonight is for the foundation, but soon." He did not say more than that. He didn't need to. Owen had already moved. He crossed the room with the particular quality of a man who argued in federal court and found no room particularly intimidating, and stopped 6 feet from Mitchell's chair. He looked at his brother-in-law with the expression of someone who had spent 3 weeks drafting the legal architecture of a specific outcome and was watching the first stage of it click into place. "Owen." Mitchell's voice was steadier now. He was recomposing. He was, Sylvia had to grant him, genuinely intelligent. "I don't think this is the place." "I agree entirely," Owen said pleasantly. "Which is why I'm going to procedural and quiet so that the foundation evening continue with dignity." He paused, just briefly. "My father would like that." He glanced once toward Vanessa's table. Vanessa was sitting down. Sylvia wasn't certain exactly when she had sat down, but she was seated now with her wine glass in front of her untouched, and she was looking at Constance Hargrove, who was standing 12 feet away, regarding her with the calm, complete assessment of a woman who had spent decades reading people's intentions with judicial precision. Constance walked toward Vanessa's table with no urgency whatsoever. She stopped. She looked at Vanessa. She said nothing for a moment, which was its own form of communication that Vanessa visibly did not know how to respond to. "I don't think we've been introduced," Constance said finally. Her voice was even. It carried the specific texture of a woman who had been the most authorized person in many rooms and did not require acknowledgement of the fact. Vanessa opened her mouth. "I know who you are," Constance said, gently stopping her. "I also know what you thought you were doing this evening." She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "You confused proximity to something real for possession of it. That's a common mistake. The consequences of it," her gaze moved briefly, comprehensively across the room, "tend to be long-lasting." She turned and walked back toward her husband. That was the entirety of it. 1 minute, perhaps. No raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic gesture. And it was the most complete and final thing that had happened in the ballroom all evening, including the statement Sylvia had made into the microphone, because this was a different register entirely. Not the anger of a betrayed wife, but the calm assessment of an institution looking at something that had attempted to damage it and finding the attempt almost beneath acknowledgement. At a nearby table, Dr. Patricia Lim, who had been watching the entire sequence of events with the focused attention she gave to everything that mattered, leaned toward the physician beside her and said 2 words very quietly. The physician nodded. Both of them reached for their phones. These were the small, invisible movements that would propagate outward through the professional networks of the city in the hours and days to come. But right now, the immediate situation was still resolving itself, and it was resolving in the direction of Mitchell Beaumont. Mitchell was standing at his chair. He had the specific posture of a man trying to reconstruct authority in a situation that had removed it. He was looking at Sylvia, who was standing near her father, composed, complete, the ivory of her dress warm in the ballroom's light. Sylvia. His voice had dropped all professional performance. This was his actual voice, the one she recognized from Fort Tolstoy's real marriage, the voice that had existed before the gap opened. Low, uncertain, almost young. Can we? Not tonight, she said, quietly, without cruelty. Owen will be in touch, she turned to her father. Bernard looked at her with the careful, unhurried attention he always gave her. I want to stay for the rest of the program, she said, for Dr. Whitfield's recognition. Bernard almost smiled. Of course. They returned to the table. Patricia, who had moved to take the seat Mitchell had vacated, leaned toward Sylvia and said nothing for a moment. Then, in a voice just above a murmur, You want to tell me how long you've been sitting on that? 89 days, Sylvia said. Patricia absorbed this. And you held it through 3 committee meetings and the September board review. It wasn't the right moment yet. Patricia looked at her. Then she picked up her own glass and said simply, I've been watching you handle rooms for 20 years, Sylvia. That was the best thing I have ever seen you do. Sylvia looked at the stage where the foundation's chairman was preparing to introduce Dr. Whitfield. I haven't done the important part yet, she said. That's tomorrow. The morning after the foundation dinner, Owen called at 8:15. Mitchell's attorney reached out at 7:45, he said. He wants to discuss terms before we file. Tell him we file Thursday regardless, Sylvia said. She was standing at the window of her bedroom, coffee in hand, the city moving in the early morning light in the ordinary way. Cities moved when significant things were quietly in motion within them. Filing Thursday isn't a threat, it's the schedule. Understood. There's something else. A brief pause. The Hargrove Foundation's Pharmaceutical Partnerships Committee meets next month. Vanessa Cole's company is on the renewal list. Sylvia set her coffee down on the windowsill. That decision isn't mine, she said carefully. That's the committee's decision, of course, Owen said. I'm just telling you the timeline in case it becomes relevant to anything. Owen. Yes, don't move pieces I haven't asked you to move. A pause. Then, with the particular tone of a younger brother who respected his older sister completely and still occasionally needed to be redirected. Noted. She hung up. She went to get ready for her 7 o'clock case. The surgery was a 6-hour mitral valve repair on a 53-year-old woman named Barbara, who had been waiting 7 months for an opening in Sylvia's schedule. Sylvia stood at the table for those 6 hours, with the complete and undivided presence that her patients required, and received without exception, and she did not think about the foundation dinner or Mitchell or Owen's careful maneuvering. Once. This was the thing about surgery that she had always valued. It demanded your whole self. There was no bandwidth for anything else. You were entirely there, or you were not there at all. Barbara came through perfectly. Sylvia was in the scrub sink at 2:15 when her chief resident appeared in the doorway. There are 3 messages from a Mr. Beaumont, he said, consulting his phone with the expression of someone who had learned not to ask questions that weren't his to ask. Tell him I'll be in touch through my attorney, she said. He left. She finished scrubbing out. In her office at 3 o'clock, she found a voicemail from Mitchell that she hadn't heard. Because her phone had been in her locker for 6 hours. She listened to it, standing with her coat still on, her surgical cap still leaving its impression in her hair. His voice on the message was different from the voice he had used in the ballroom. Quieter. The performance was entirely gone now, which was, she thought, possibly the most honest she had heard him sound in 3 years. "I know you have everything in motion," he said. "I know what Owen has put together, and I know I'm not going to be able to contest most of it, and I'm not calling about the legal side. I'm calling because I owe you the truth about some things, and you deserve to hear it from me and not through a deposition." "I know I know I don't have the right to ask. I'm asking anyway. Call me when you want to. Or don't, I understand." She listened to it, once. She stood very still for a moment in her office with the late afternoon city behind her window. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to her 3:30 consultation. The weeks that followed had the specific quality of time during which large things moved slowly and small things moved quickly. Owen filed on Thursday as scheduled. Mitchell's attorney responded with the particular professional courtesy of someone who had been told not to contest, but to negotiate toward clean terms, which was what happened when both parties had decided for their own reasons but just the process served no one. Sylvia worked. She operated 4 days a week. She sat on 3 committees. She had dinner with her parents on Sunday evenings, which was what she had always done. And her father talked about the foundation's next grant cycle, and her mother talked about a former clerk who had just been appointed to the appellate bench. And the evenings were warm and grounding, and entirely ordinary, in the way that her family's consistent presence had always been the thing that made the other parts of her life sustainable. She called Mitchell on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the dinner. He picked up immediately. She could hear in the way he said her name that he had been waiting for the call with more care than he would have admitted. "You said you owed me the truth," she said. "I have 40 minutes. He talked for 35 of them. He told her things she had suspected and some she hadn't. He told her that the gap between who he was and who he had needed to appear to be had been widening for the last 4 years, and that he had handled that widening in the worst possible way, which was to fill it with something that made him feel like the gap wasn't there. He told her that he had not been honest with himself about what was happening until the night of the foundation dinner, when the full weight of what he had built and what he had done to it had landed on him simultaneously in front of 400 people, and he had understood, in the clarifying way of things that could not be undone, that he had already lost the most important thing he had. She listened. She did not perform sympathy, and she did not perform coldness. She simply listened the way she listened to patients presenting histories with the complete, non-judgmental attention of someone's job was to understand what actually happened, how the ship, rather than respond to a version of it. When he was quiet, she said. He was silent for a moment. "Does it change anything?" "No," she said, not unkindly, "but you needed to say it, and I needed to hear it. That's what it changes." A long pause. "What are you going to do?" he asked. After, she looked at the window of her office. The city at night, moving below in the way cities moved, indifferent and continuous, and full of its own business, regardless of what happened inside any particular building. "I've been talking to Patricia Lim," she said, "and 2 other people. About building something. A surgical fellowship program focused on women in cardiac surgery, funded through the foundation." She paused. "We've been sketching the framework for 4 months. 4 months, Mitchell said. "I had time," she said simply. "I was being patient." He made a sound that might have been a brief, private acknowledgement of everything that single sentence contained. Then, "You'll be extraordinary at it." She received this without deflecting it. "I know," she said. "Take care of yourself, Mitchell." She hung up. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Then she opened the fellowship framework document that she and Patricia, and their 3rd colleague, a thoracic surgeon named Dr. James Okafor, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of institutional backing to move on an initiative he had been designing for 2 years, had been building in the margins of everything else. She read through the current draft. She made 4 notes. She sent them both a message, ready to move to the next stage. "Can we meet Thursday?" Patricia responded in under a minute. "I've been ready for a month." "Thursday," James responded, 4 minutes later with a single line. "Finally." Thursday, the divorce was finalized on a gray February morning. Owen handled it with the efficient care he gave to everything that mattered to people he loved. Sylvia signed the last page in his office, with the winter light coming through the window, and, when she set the pen down, Owen looked at her across the desk with the expression he reserved for things that genuinely moved him. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. He came around the desk. He put his arms around his sister for a moment in the way siblings did when words were insufficient. She let herself be held briefly. Then she straightened her coat. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "Always," he said. "Just that." She walked out of his building into the February morning and stood on the sidewalk and breathed cold air and felt the specific quality of something finished, not the sharp white finish of the ballroom, not the microphone, and the footsteps, and the room understanding everything at once. Just the quiet administrative end of paperwork, the legal conclusion of something that had ended in every real sense months before. She called her mother. Constance picked up before the second ring. "It's done," Sylvia said. A pause. When Constance spoke, her voice had the particular texture it only had on the phone, when she wasn't managing a room, when she was simply a mother. "How do you feel?" "Like I can breathe without accounting for it," Sylvia said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "That's exactly correct." They stayed on the line for a few seconds without speaking. "Dinner Sunday," Constance said. "Yes, I'll bring dessert." She put her phone in her pocket and started walking toward her office, toward Patricia and James and the fellowship framework and the February grant cycle and the work that was already in motion, and that was completely and without qualification hers. 6 weeks later, the fellowship was announced. Not through a press release, through Sylvia's own professional voice. A direct statement posted through the hospital's communications office and through the Hargrove Foundation simultaneously at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, with the framework document attached and the application portal open. The Hargrove Beaumont Women in Cardiac Surgery Fellowship. Her name, not Mitchell's, first. Initial funding of $8 million. First cohort of 8 fellows. 18 months of structured clinical mentorship, plus research support, plus direct access to the surgical network that she and Patricia and James had spent their collective careers building. Applications opened at 9. By noon, there were 211 of them. Sylvia was in surgery when her assistant texted her the number at 11:45. She was between cases, 10 minutes in the hallway, gloves off. She read the number twice. She texted back one line to Patricia, 2:11 in 3 hours. Patricia's response arrived before Sylvia had put her phone back in her pocket. I refreshed the page 4 times to make sure it was real. Sylvia stood in the hallway of the hospital that bore her family's name and felt the specific, clean, uncomplicated reality of something she had built being real in a way that couldn't be argued with. Not a reaction to Mitchell, not a performance for anyone who had been in that ballroom. Just work, real, consequential, necessary work that had been waiting for the right conditions and the right time, and the specific freedom that came from having finished one thing completely before beginning another. 200 women who had needed exactly this. She went back in for her next case. On the morning the fellowship profile ran in a national medical journal, not the society pages, not the hospital newsletter, the actual peer-reviewed leadership publication that people in her field read when they were paying attention to what was happening to the shape of their profession. Mitchell read it in an office that no longer had his name on the door. He had been in the process for 3 weeks now of the specific, unglamorous work of rebuilding at a smaller scale, without the infrastructure he had been relying on, which was uncomfortable and clarifying in approximately equal measure. He read the profile twice. He looked at the photograph accompanying it, which showed Sylvia standing in a hallway outside an OR in her surgical gear, with her cap still on and her eyes direct, and the expression of someone who had been in this room her entire life and knew exactly what she was doing in it. Well, he thought about the night of the foundation dinner and what he had understood in those 10 seconds. After her family walked through the door, he had thought, for the preceding 6 months, that he was in the process of leaving a marriage. He had understood, in those 10 seconds, that he had not been leaving a marriage at all. He had been leaving a context, the full, structural, relational context of what it meant to be connected to Sylvia Beaumont. and the world she carried, and he had understood it only in the moment when he could see it clearly, because he had already removed himself from it. He put the journal down. He had work to do. What remained of it? It was genuinely his, genuinely built from his own particular intelligence and competence, and there was something strangely clarifying about that. About being stripped of the scaffolding and finding that what was underneath was still real. He thought about what Sylvia had said on the phone. Take care of yourself, Mitchell. The way she had meant it, not as a formality, not as the polite punctuation of a finished conversation, but as something genuine from a woman who had decided, for reasons entirely her own, not to carry hatred out of a situation that had given her sufficient cause. You couldn't argue with that. You couldn't negotiate with it. You could only receive it and try to be worth it going forward, privately, and without audience, and without any reasonable expectation that she would ever know. He picked up his phone. He called his attorney. He said, "Whatever she's asked for in the property division, if it's fair, we agree. I don't want it to go long." His attorney paused. "Mitchell, there are some valuation questions on the—" "I want it clean and fast," Mitchell said. "That's my priority. Call Owen Hargrove directly." He ended the call. He went back to work. Vanessa Cole left the city 4 months after the foundation dinner. Not dramatically. There was no announcement, no public exit. The pharmaceutical company she worked for had offices in 3 other cities, and when a transfer opened in March, she applied for it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had recalibrated what the next few years needed to look like. She had understood several things in the weeks following the dinner that she had not understood going in. She had understood them sitting across from a career consultant who was honest with her in the particular useful way of people who were paid to see situations clearly. She had understood them standing in her apartment at 2 a.m, reading a text from Mitchell that was 3 lines, long, and that communicated with the compression of someone who had run out of ways to frame something difficult, that he was sorry, and that it was over, and that he hoped she would be okay. She had understood, sitting with that text, that Eleanor Whitmore's line from a different ballroom in a different story was not actually about ballrooms at all. Borrowed attention was not power. It felt like power from the inside, felt exactly like it, warm and bright, and directed specifically at you. And then it ended, and you were left holding the borrowed thing, and the person it belonged to had walked away. And what you had was the specific clarifying silence of understanding that the thing had never been yours. She got on a plane to Chicago on a Thursday morning in April. She did not look back at the city as it fell away beneath the plane. She was already thinking about the next thing, the actual thing, the work that would be hers, because she had built it from her own material without relying on anyone else's infrastructure. That was the lesson. That was the thing she was carrying forward into the next version of her life. At 36, with plenty of time to build something real if she was willing to begin from the honest starting point rather than the convenient one. It was not a comfortable lesson. It was, however, a permanent one. The keynote invitation arrived in October. It came to Sylvia's office, addressed to her professionally, to Dr. Sylvia Beaumont, Fellowship Director, and it was from a consortium of women in médecins who were convening their annual leadership summit in January, and who wanted her to deliver the opening address to an audience of 600 physicians, researchers, and medical administrators. She read the invitation. Then she called James. "The Ascend Summit," she said. "They want me to open." "Of course they do," James said, without any qualification in his voice. "Are you going to do it?" She looked at the invitation in her hand. She thought about standing in the Grand Meridian Ballroom 8 months before, holding a microphone, saying 11 words into a room of 430 people, with her family coming through the door behind her. She thought about what those 11 words had been, and what they had actually meant, and what, if she were being precise about it, she wanted to say when she had 600 people's complete attention and a podium and 35 minutes. Something larger than 11 words. Something that wasn't about Mitchell, wasn't about Vanessa, wasn't about the ballroom at all. Something about what it actually took to build authority that lasted. "Send my acceptance," she said. She delivered the keynote on a Tuesday morning in January. She stood at the podium without notes. She had written them and then set them aside because notes were for uncertainty. And she was not uncertain, and she was not uncertain. And she's power actually looked like from the inside. Not the performance of it. Not the acquisition of it. The quiet, daily, incremental work of building something that held because its foundations were genuine. She spoke about the difference between the kind of credibility that came from proximity to someone else's achievement and the kind that came from doing the work yourself. In the room, over the years, in a way that couldn't be removed from you because it lived in what you had actually done rather than in who you knew or whose name you were standing next to. She did not mention the foundation dinner. She did not need to. Every woman in that room had her own version of the story. That was the thing. These were physicians and researchers and administrators who had spent careers navigating exactly the architecture she was describing, who had spent years being underestimated or overlooked or positioned adjacent to someone else's authority, and who had done the harder, slower, less visible work of building something real anyway. When she finished, the room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then 600 people rose. Sylvia stood at the podium and received it. She did not minimize it. She did not deflect it with a self-deprecating gesture or a rushed thank you. She had been the most prepared person in enough rooms and had earned enough of what was being offered in this one that she could stand in it with complete composure and let it be exactly what it was. She found Patricia in the front row, standing with everyone else, with the expression of a woman who had known exactly what was going to happen when they put her colleague at a podium, with nothing between her and the room but the truth. Sylvia stepped back from the microphone. She thought about 89 days of waiting, about a Tuesday afternoon on a sidewalk outside a restaurant, about the specific sustained discipline of knowing something and choosing not to react to it prematurely, not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but out of the absolute conviction that the right moment would arrive, and that when it did, everything she had prepared would be exactly sufficient. She thought about 211 applications on a Tuesday morning and what that number meant about how many women had been waiting for someone to build exactly this specific thing. She thought about what she had told Owen the night she had called him. I want there to be no ambiguity for anyone. There was no ambiguity now. There hadn't been for months. Vanessa Cole had stood up in a room that carried the Hargrove name and raised a glass toward a woman she had fundamentally misread. She had looked at a wife and seen an obstacle. She had not seen a physician with 20 years of irreplaceable skill. She had not seen a daughter and a sister, and the continuation of something that had been built before she was born. She had not seen the 89 days of patience, or the 3 weeks of legal architecture, or the fellowship framework that had been growing in the margins of a marriage that was ending, ready to exist fully the moment the ending was complete. She had not understood that what she was toasting against was not a woman she had already defeated. She was toasting against a foundation, and foundations did not fall. Because someone raised a glass in their direction, they remained. They outlasted the evening, outlasted the people who had misread them, outlasted every version of the story that someone else had tried to write over the original. 211 women, then 340 by the close of the application window, then the first cohort of 8 fellows standing in a hospital corridor on a Monday morning in March, white coats on, looking at the woman who had built this thing for them with the specific expression of people who had been waiting for it to exist. Sylvia looked back at them. She thought of many things in that moment. Then she put them aside because there was work to do, and she was above all else a woman who did her work. Let's get started, she said.